So they rather make the mess they are doing in Europe than fix the Security Council or the Charter. And that is the problem, is the double standard and the hypocrisy of Europe. I mean, we can remember the invasion of Kosovo, right? The Serbia. They were members of NATO. NATO had no grounds to be there, and they just took over functions that should have been taken by the Security Council. And that was illegal, highly illegal, and nothing happened. Not even an apology, no, nothing happened. The problem here is that we are not looking at the root causes.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Roberto Zamora, an international lawyer and peace activist who, back in 2004, managed to force his home country, neutral Costa Rica, to withdraw from the so-called Coalition of the Willing, who back then attacked and subsequently occupied Iraq. This and the politics of Central America is what we want to discuss today. So, Roberto, welcome.
Pascal, thank you very much for this opportunity to be here and discuss such an interesting issue today. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, because you reached out to me and sent me your master thesis in which you kind of analyzed Costa Rica's neutrality. And in that context, you also let me know that it was you who 20 years ago put forward a lawsuit that then in the end obliged Costa Rica to withdraw from the Coalition of the Willing. Can you tell us the story of that of Costa Rica, how it came to join that coalition and how you forced it out again?
Sure. It's not really a long story. It is, I believe, a well-known fact in the international community that Costa Rica has maintained a neutrality policy for a very long time, and that this neutrality policy was expressed in unilateral declaration of international law in 1983, when President Monge, under the pressure of the Americans, decided to escape of the wars of the Cold War, especially the one in Nicaragua, by declaring Costa Rica neutral. We by now, luckily, the facts are out and the history has been rewritten, so we know what happened and what were the motivations that led the United States and the UK to create a coalition of the willing to invade Iraq, because this intervention or invasion on Iraq had no grounds in international law. They tried to find other ways to legitimate this invasion, and that was basically creating the support from a group of very random states, if you look at the list of the members of that coalition of the willing. And we have to recall, because one question that I get a lot when talking about this issue is, what was Costa Rica bringing to the coalition of the willing and to the invasion of Iraq if we don't have an army?
Because you got rid of your army back in 48, 49, right?
48, that's correct. And we were not bringing military might. We were supposed to be bringing moral might. Maybe you recall that at the very beginning, in the first speeches of Bush about the war, he said that this was a war for peace, democracy, and human rights. And if you think of any country in the world that can have a say with some moral authority on peace, democracy, and human rights, you want Costa Rica on your list, because indeed Costa Rica is one of the few countries that can talk with property about peace, democracy, and human rights. So there you can see why the United States wanted Costa Rica in the list, why the United States use its normal mechanisms to press on the government to obtain this support, which is removal of aid, most likely. And back then, at the very moment that the coalition of the willing started its invasion, President Pacheco decided to issue its public support in the name of Costa Rica to the coalition of the willing. And I was starting third year of law school. Mm, I mean, the news came very bad in the country. I mean, 99.2% of the population was against the decision. I mean, I've never saw a poll so cited as to 99.2% of the population rejecting a decision. And I was very upset, and it came through my mind, well, we are law students, let's try something. And at the end, nobody wanted to do anything, so I decided to just try it. Costa Rica's legal system is very friendly, if I can use the word, for constitutional issues. I mean, it's very easy to have access to the Supreme Court to discuss issues of constitutionality. So, for instance, I didn't need a lawyer. I needed just somebody to authenticate my signature and pay 30 cents of a dollar, and that was it. Um, so I decided to give it a try. I mean, I decided to give it a try and to challenge the support given to the coalition of the willing, claiming several violations of international law, including a specific violation on the Neutrality Declaration.
Sorry, just to be clear, like your argument was based on Costa Rica being in breach of its own international obligations, right? That's the argument you tabled and submitted to your Supreme Court in Costa Rica.
Correct. So Article 7 of Costa Rica's constitution establishes that Costa Rica is bound by international law. In fact, Costa Rica has a full monist legal system, which means we don't make a distinction between domestic and international law. Once international law has been approved by the Congress and is now part of the domestic legal system as one. So here in Costa Rica, you can go to the court and directly claim violations to international regulations. Because the Constitution establishes as such. So, I mean, there were many arguments. I argued violations to the right of self-determination of the Iraqi people. I mean, I claimed several, but the court decided not to work on them, leave them aside, and just stick with the ones that constituted a violation. So the court said that the support was unconstitutional for three main reasons. The first was the most obvious violation to the Neutrality Declaration. It is, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the nuclear test case, the International Court of Justice said that when recognizing the legal value of unilateral acts, it said that unilateral acts are normally very specific, and that in their contents, that these unilateral obligations are very specific in the way they are framed and phrased, and how the country then is understood as bound. So the Costa Rica's Neutrality Declaration is a beautiful 7-page long document. And in one of its clauses, it says that it should not give any support of any kind, so it shall not be involved in reality or apparently in a conflict of others. So Costa Rica's neutrality has to be so strict, so it should never even give an impression that is taking a side in a conflict of others.
Yeah.
And here is where the violation to Costa Rica's neutrality happened.
And here, just for everybody listening, it's important to know that so the 7-page document is the document of 1983 that Costa Rica declared and announced to the world. By the way, from today on, this is our policy. And Costa Rica views this as it's binding on itself. That's why it's a unilateral act, right? It doesn't depend on whether other states recognize it. Costa Rica says, this is my stance and this is valid and valid on myself. And you picked them up on that and said, so we want to, we demand that you stick to your own rules.
Yes, that was somehow the core subject of my master's thesis, to find if there were grounds on international law for such a thing to happen, and I was very much amazed by the discoveries in terms of how many grounds in international law a neutrality declaration like the one Costa Rica issued has. So the first violation was to the neutrality obligation.
Mhm.
The second violation is a consequence of the first, because it's a violation to the obligation to respect international obligations. And the third one is because the court said that Costa Rica cannot support any action taken outside the scope and control of the Security Council. So, because the invasion of Iraq had not been authorized in Resolution 1441, then Costa Rica was not able to support that action without violating its obligation under the Charter. So the court found that Costa Rica, by supporting the coalition of the willing, was in violation of the charter itself.
This is beautiful because it means Costa Rica Supreme Court found that any country part of the UN Charter was in breach. That would be a logical consequence. But congratulations to your Supreme Court. That's a fantastic Supreme Court.
It was, yes, it was. It was a fantastic Supreme Court, and yeah, I mean, now that I have, well, I'm older and I have studied much further on the issue. I wish the court would have, well, it's not made of experts in international law. It's actually was a very, very rare case, because it's normally tackling constitutionality issues not grounded on international law, right? But at least oh, and then the court did something, which was that we have a mixed constitutional system. It's a written constitution, but we also have a non-written constitution, right? And this written constitution evolves through the rulings of the Constitutional Supreme Court. The court said that the neutrality declaration or the neutrality obligations have to be understood as incorporated as a part of the non-written constitutional system in Costa Rica. So they basically,
Elevate.
I don't know if upgraded the neutrality declaration, but they did incorporated it in the constitution. So by the time the Congress passed the law on neutrality, it wasn't really necessary, because it was already a part of the Constitution.
When did Congress pass this law?
It was not long ago. Let me check it real quick. In 2014, when they issued the law recognizing the right to peace. And as we spoke before, in Costa Rica, we understand neutrality as a part of a broader foreign policy, which is the peace policy. So that's why it's included in the right to peace law.
That is very interesting. So it was the Supreme Court that elevated the foreign policy to having constitutional force. And later the Congress also made a law about this, so it's also in the legal code. But in a sense, I mean, the Constitution, of course, is on a higher level, but that just means it's baked in very, very tightly. And for you in 2004, this meant that you could force, I mean, once this decision was out, then the president was forced to withdraw that statement of support. Or what happened exactly after the verdict came out?
Yeah, it is exactly as you mentioned. It was very uh it was very simple, and then it came out on the news. I mean, it was everywhere in the news, even in the United States. It came out on the news, big. It was on the main media. The Costa Rican Ministry of Foreign Affairs sent a note saying to the Colin Powell, the Secretary of State at the time, that well, we have this ruling, so we have to withdraw. And next day, I I received the fax at my house from Colin Powell
What?
saying that uh, Costa Rica was now out of the list of the coalition of the willing. And I mean, I'm just very sorry I never got a photocopy, because faxes, as you know, they erase with time. But it was a little bit surreal for me at 24 years old just to get a fax from Colin Powell to my house saying you're out of the coalition of the willing.
So because you were the plaintiff, you're the one who forced the case. So Powell actually then notified the plaintiff. That's interesting that they did that.
Yeah, I mean, they of course they notified the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the court and everything, but I mean, there was no need to send me that fax. It's just a very fun anecdote that I got that one.
Congratulations.
But yeah, but it was very, very easy. I mean, it took maybe 3 days after the ruling came out to have Costa Rica out of the list of the coalition of the willing.
But this really shows also the force that the law can have and how it escalates up if done correctly. So this is well, that was a great achievement, and you struck your own country out of that list. That was, I think that matters. That-
Yeah, yeah. I mean, especially if you take into consideration the record that the Americans have on abiding to, international obligations, that they don't really have a very good record, and they could have not cared much, but the fact that they did kind of says something. It says something. Costa Rica is not a big, powerful country. Um, we have always made our grounds before the international community. I mean, and even before the Americans. The, the circumstances in which the neutrality declaration was issued was Costa Rica standing its ground before the Americans.
Can you explain that one a little bit more? I mean, that takes us back to 1983, but in which sense did Costa Rican neutrality mean that you stand your ground?
Yes, I think it's very important because Costa Rica's um the, the way Costa Rica used neutrality as a legal mechanism to be forced to stay away from conflicts, I think it was a brilliant idea. So in the still in the 80s, the Cold War was very hot in different part of the words in the world, including Central America, particularly Nicaragua. So in the late 70s, a communist supported group, the Sandinistas, started a revolution and took control of the country. And being so close to the Panama Canal and to Cuba, the Americans were not happy of having a stronghold of the communist bloc in Central America. So they they created the Contra, which was a group, a paramilitary group, aimed at overthrowing the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. So they started by supporting. So Nicaragua limits to the north with Guatemala and El Salvador, and to the south to Costa Rica. So in Guatemala and El Salvador, Honduras and El Salvador, the CIA was setting camps and training the Contras and giving all the support. So they were invading Nicaragua from the north. But they also wanted to invade from the south, take control of the San Juan River, which goes all the way to the Nicaragua Lake, basically crosses most of Nicaragua. And so they could pincer the Sandinistas from the north and the south. And we didn't really want to take part in that. So the Costa Rican president at the time, President Luis Alberto Monge, started a tour in the search for support if Costa Rica was to declare itself neutral, fearing sanctions or something from the Americans. The history recounts that for some reason, President Monge was very much of the likes of the Queen Elizabeth. President Monge didn't even go to university. He was a peasant. I mean, he comes from a family of farmers, and he was back in the day. Costa Rica was a very rural society, and it was a very small country, very poor. So I don't know what was it, but it was because of the support of Queen Elizabeth that President Monge got the necessary will and strength to decide to declare Costa Rica neutral, and then come to Reagan and say, "Hey, President Reagan, I'm sorry, but now I cannot do it because I'm obligated under their international law not to let you set the Contra camp here." So, and that's how it went. And
Just a second, just to understand the process, like Monge knew that there was a risk that the Americans will put even more pressure and will put bases, I mean CIA or whatever it will be, in Costa Rica. He was unhappy about it, thought, what can I do? Said, like, how about a unilateral declaration of neutrality, my 7-page document? He put that out, and once he had it out, he said, like, I'm sorry, I can't do anything. I mean, the document is out now. So sorry, can't have your bases. That was how it went, right?
that is exactly how it went.
That man is a brilliant person, brilliant guy.
It's brilliant. I mean, he put the country in a position where the country couldn't legally do it.
Good.
And then he came to Riga and said, like, sorry, man, I can't do it. And the Americans respected the decision. So, I mean, so when the Iraqi war happened, it was not the first time Costa Rica has stood its ground before the Americans, saying, no, there is, I mean, we are an independent country. Neutrality has been a key component of our way of understanding government, the state, and international politics since the 19th century. I mean, neutrality has been a foreign policy of Costa Rica. There is records going back to 1863. President Jesus Jimenez, in a speech to the Congress, stating how this neutrality policy has been a core of Costa Rica's foreign policy. Which
Probably in relation to the U.S. Civil War.
It might have been. It was 1863, but you can draw from his speech that neutrality was a policy even before that. I mean, we don't have all the records, but we have a record of him saying in 1863 that Costa Rica had been neutral already for a while.
So that means that in 1983, your president put out that 7-page document arguing that no, this is not a new policy. This is just now in a policy paper all the traditions that we had already going on. Is that the case?
Is that the case? In fact, he recalls these speeches in this 7-page long document, and he doesn't put it in these words, but what he's saying is that Costa Rica's declaration of neutrality was just an expression of self-determination.
Mm.
And the ICJ has been clear that one of the attributes of self-determination, which is shared with sovereignty, is the attribute of the capacity to establish its own foreign policy, which is shared by both sovereignty and self-determination. And the ICJ has said it in when referring to both legal institutes. It says one of the attributes of sovereignty is that the states are able to establish freely their own foreign policy as long as it doesn't violate general international law. And the same with self-determination. So Costa Rica's neutrality declaration is not just the exercise of attributes of sovereignty, is also the exercise of self-determination, which is recalled that it is none other than the expression of something we had been forever, which is neutral.
And it worked in 1983 to prevent the US from setting up shop and bases in Costa Rica. It worked again in 2004 to extract Costa Rica from the coalition of the willing. And how is this policy these days viewed among the general public? I mean, let's say the pressure again in 2022 was there on states to take a stance against Russia, right? I mean, the US and Europe tried very, very hard to get support for that. What's the general public in Costa Rica thinking about this policy today?
It, I mean, Costa Rica's peace policy, including neutrality, it's so embedded in our culture and idiosyncrasy that we don't even talk about it. I mean, it's not. It's like the army. We don't even talk. I mean, it's just not an issue for us. Now at the government level, um, during the Solis administration, there was um I'm not sure if it was a situation with Nicaragua or Venezuela, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs received pressure to issue a statement condemning the situation, and he refused to do so based on the Iraqi case ruling.
That was
So
pressure against Venezuela, right? Where Costa Rica was asked to take a stance against Venezuela.
yeah, I think it was in the context of the Grupo de Lima, because this happened during the Solis administration, and the ministry issued a Twitter saying we must recall what happened in 2004 when Costa Rica supported the coalition of the willing, so the ministry will refrain from issuing any statement about this. So at the government level, the case did leave a footprint that is still remembered at government level, and the government remains very careful not to cross this boundary again, um, because a very simple reason, which is that because of the country that we don't really have much to offer to the world, and there are not many things that earn us respect in the international community, but our peace policy does.
This is fascinating, and in Europe, there are a couple of neutrals left. Ireland, Switzerland, not part of the Union, but Austria and I'm forgetting one. Sorry, I'm forgetting one. Which one am I forgetting?
Malta.
Malta, yeah, of course. Yeah. And they all jumped on board with the European Union and the US sanctions. non-coercive coercive measures, non-military coercive measures, are sanctions something that would be thinkable for Costa Rica to put on one or the other belligerents in a war?
Um, are we obviating the debate about how illegal unilateral sanctions are?
Highly illegal, yeah. But so they're unthinkable for Costa Rica, right? Not just on the basis of the neutrality policy.
The thing is here because based on the Iraqi ruling, Costa Rica couldn't support unilateral sanctions for two reasons. One, because they are illegal, and any action outside of the charter, Costa Rica cannot support because of the terms of the ruling, right? So we wouldn't be able to support unilateral sanctions because that would carry a violation of the charter. Now, on the other side, I think that Costa Rica's neutrality declaration doesn't restrain itself to military action.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So the fact that Costa Rica's neutrality states that it shall not be involved even apparently on so this is just, I mean, it went as strict as possible with, and it's very important because I think that the neutrals that are applying unilateral sanctions are being highly responsible to the Institute of Neutrality.
Mm-hmm.
They are doing something that could be harmful to the Institute in a moment in history when I think what we should do is to strengthen, well, actually establish a clear framework and then strengthen the Institute of Neutrality as a way to de-escalate this resurgence of the Cold War. I mean, making the blocks bigger is not making the world safer. On the contrary. So uh, I, I highly believe that enforcing unilateral sanctions is a way to support um, an adversary. I mean, it to me that this doesn't really have to wait until the issue uh, comes out as use of force or belligerency. Uh, is the hostile element what is problematic? I mean, you don't have to wage war. You can be hostile in many other ways, and then it's on the other state whether or not it considers it's being under attack. And there are many ways to attack a country right now. Cyber warfare, for instance. You don't shoot a bullet, and then you're being belligerent or hostile.
I highly applaud what you're saying here, and I view it exactly the same way. The problem the Europeans at the moment have is that they then argue, but Roberto, not putting sanctions on Russia is equal to condoning an illegal invasion of another country. So you are rewarding the aggressor of who is in breach of international law. How can that be a neutral act?
I think that would be a very coward and unfounded argument because let's keep things real. If we had a functional Security Council,
Mhm.
then this might have stopped already. So what you cannot do is to try to find ways to bypass a law that is not functioning because you don't want it to function.
And you're referring to the security to the fact that
To
the
the Europe,
Security Council has the legal power to put sanctions and military action. Yeah.
correct, and the permanent members, which are, I mean, we have 3 out of 5 permanent members of the Security Council that are members of NATO, and Europe normally acts as a bloc. So we basically have the Americans, the British and then Europe having a veto. So um yeah, I mean, it's and then there is this question that I keeps ringing in my head, which is NATO trying to override or absorb the functions that had been created for the Security Council? And it's so they rather make the mess they are doing in Europe than fix the Security Council or the Charter. And that is the problem, is the double standard and the hypocrisy of Europe that is part of this problem. It is not, but I mean, we can remember the invasion of Kosovo, right? The Serbia. They were members of NATO. NATO had no grounds to be there, and they just took over functions that would or should have been taken by the Security Council, and that was illegal, highly illegal, and nothing happened, and not even an apology, no, nothing happened. So I mean, the problem here is that we are not looking at the root causes, not of the conflict, but the causes why the conflicts are not being solved, and the reasons why the Security Council is not able to deliver its functions. They will never ever bring to the table the fact that the charter has to change. The veto power was a fundamental flaw, breaking the equality of nations principle that the charter so much talks about, and that's a historical flaw that the Europeans and the powerful are not willing to fix. It's just arrogance that is best.
I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. It's utter arrogance. I would like to know what's your opinion on Article 51, since we are talking about changing the charter. Article 51 is the self-defense and collective self-defense clause. You know that countries are allowed to defend themselves and do so in coalition with others, which to me is a cornerstone of every modern war we've seen. Even Russia right now says, "Oh, we the legal argument is they recognize Donbass and Lugansk as sovereign states, and now they ask Russia for support, and now they collectively defend against Ukraine. And it's also, the self-defense clause was used so many times in order to justify U.S. aggressions against other states. Oh, we are just helping to defend the other one collectively. Do you see it? Would you change that one as well?
Not necessarily. I think that the problem comes from the interpretation that has been given to the article, because I think that, but by no means there is nothing in the discussions or in the article indicating that these regional mechanisms would eliminate the role of the Security Council. In fact, all these mechanisms, or even countries self-defending by themselves, save the redundancy, they had to communicate to the Security Council, who would then take action. So it was like an intermediary step, more like a cautionary mechanisms before the Security Council could make a decision. But by no means the article can be interpreted in this way, when the article clearly states that in the end all these actions have to receive the final approval of the Security Council. And here, both the NATO treaty and the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance have a fundamental flaw, and it's a clause that I think is absolutely contrary to international law, which is the clause that says, in the case that a certain state is under attack, the other states will consider themselves attacked, and as such So it's very funny because this is bypassing Article 51. If you are under attack, I mean, if we are all under attack, it's not really collective self-defense, is a collective of states in exercising self-defense on their own because they are all under attack. So the concept of collective self-defense is a group of states backing one state that is under attack. But what the NATO clause says is, no, we are all under attack, even when materially we are not under attack. And the ICJ has said that an aggression is a material situation. So it's not just, oh, I decide that now I'm under attack so I can exercise self-defense. I mean, NATO creates this fiction of an invasion that doesn't exist to legitimize states to exercise self-defense. Now, if you think it this way, it's a bunch of states exercising self-defense. This is not collective self-defense, as in the terms of the charter. And the reason to do so is because you can bypass Article 51 because you don't need permission to exercise self-defense.
Yeah,
You need permission if you want to exercise collective self-defense. So by declaring everybody as a subject of invasion, I can claim that I'm individually exercising self-defense, and we are all individually exercising self-defense. So we don't have to go by Article 51. So it's fraud of law, if you ask me.
yeah. The main issues is that that countries find not loopholes. They find legalistic reasoning in order then to implement facts as they like. I mean, NATO just implemented a fact, and since there is no court that can judge, I mean, there would be a court that could judge over them, but it would still not limit the power of NATO to do so. But especially viewed from Costa Rica, this is just a very unsatisfactory state of affairs, right? And the beautiful thing about the Costa Rican case is that it shows that individual countries, by unilateral declarations, can actually extricate themselves from this logic to a certain extent. So, in a sense, if we look at the BRICS movement and movement of countries in Asia and in Africa that also are looking for policies that allows them to extricate themselves from these political from these political games, and then I mean Costa Rica is a case to learn from.
Right, because it is also true that the Costa Rica's decision had an impact in the region. Panama abolished its army in 1990. And part of the reasons was that there was absolutely no breath coming from its neighboring country. And then because of the Darien jungle, it's impossible to invade from Colombia, at least on the ground. So, and then Costa Rica was key for the Central American peace process because it was the only country that could mediate there, that it was part of the region, it was not in conflict with anybody, and it was able to bring the parties together and bring the Central American conflict to an end in 1986 or 87, the Esquipulas Treaty, and Esquipulas Treaty. So, and then if you look at Costa Rica in international organisms, it's normally given preference or the presidency of the table when dealing with issues of peace or demilitarization. I mean, it works beyond. I want to show my disagreement with something I read recently. You sent me some very interesting pieces, but there is this piece that frames neutrality as a selfish act, and I have to absolutely disagree. It is in the effort of providing a friendly and peaceful environment for contending parties that neutrality has to be understood. It is an effort to remain independent beyond and before any pressure or circumstance, so things do not escalate. You know, I think it is anything selfish in neutrality. It is on the contrary. One of the interesting things the Supreme Court said in the Iraqi ruling that the government has not really followed is that because of Costa Rica's peace policy, and again, neutrality being just part of it, Costa Rica is in, and Costa Rica's neutrality was issued as ideologically active, which means that Costa Rica has an obligation to consistently pursue peace. So Costa Rican neutrality doesn't prevent the country from every kind of involvement in conflicts of others. It does allow the country to intervene to find a peaceful solution. It is the only way Costa Rica can get involved in a conflict of others is to try to bring them together and to bring a peaceful solution to the conflict, which is a unique element of Costa Rica neutrality. I don't know any other country that has this obligation. And the Supreme Court does take that and highlights, and it says to the government, you shouldn't be joining this coalition of the willing. You should be actively engaging in international politics to help bring peace. And the government hasn't really done that. But it's from the legal perspective and from the legal point of view, it's there. The court recalled it. And so going back to the point, if you think of neutrality in this sense, that I will not get involved, I will not escalate, I will not make the thing bigger than it is, and I will provide a space and a place to bring the parties together and end the conflict as a way to achieve peace, as one of the goals established in the charter, then I cannot agree on seeing neutrality as a selfish foreign policy. I have to strongly disagree on that point of view. It was very brave from Costa Rica to declare its neutrality in the circumstances it did, and it was very brave from the country to maintain its neutrality in the circumstances that it did in 2004.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's a policy for the word.
Yeah. Because neutrality, somebody who put it really beautifully was Uro Kekkonen, the Finnish former prime minister, and he once said, neutrality is not the easiest of all policies, because it means that you need to constantly adjust your foreign policy, and you need to constantly find new ways to be independent and to stand your ground because you need to defend your own point of view towards everybody, right? Because both of them are going to pressure you, and that's a big misunderstanding. And I'm very glad to know that Costa Rica is actively working on clearing up that misunderstanding, and it's standing its ground, as opposed to today's Finland and Sweden, which didn't stand their ground, which gave up their ground, and now they have 15 and 17 military US bases. And now they made themselves a target. If ever there's a NATO-Russia war, they're going to be the first frontline states. And that's the sad reality.
I think that Finland and other
Sweden.
states from the area made a massive mistake when joining NATO and abandoning neutrality. They pretty much added lemon to the scar. You know, they did exactly what the Russians have been complaining about for the past 20 years, which is they kept coming closer to them. If you check at the documents on relations between Sweden and Finland in the last 20 years, they weren't bad, and there were no signs at all of Russian thinking of incursions in Finland by I mean, there was nothing to make the Finns think that the Russians were a threat to them. But they were subject to all this propaganda and the exacerbation of the Ukrainian invasion, which is illegal. I will not discuss whether or not that invasion is illegal. But the fact that that it's that is illegal, it doesn't mean that there are some uncomfortable issues we should talk about this invasion. For instance, I mean, Putin warned everybody in Munich in 2007, if I'm not mistaken, in this very, very, very famous speech. And it is true that NATO promised not to expand 1 inch to the east, and they have not done that. And this leads us to a very, very important discussion that I'm pretty sure many countries don't want to have, which is at which point my security is your threat or your concern. Um, I don't know if it's very harsh from my side to use the situation in the United States as an example. Yeah, you have the right to bear guns for security, so you feel safer. I don't think anybody feels safer now that there's shootings everywhere all the time in the schools every week. Uh, I think last year statistically there were over one school shooting per day in the United States last year. Uh, so are we all safer if you feel safer? At which point a collective security mechanism becomes a collective threat mechanism.
Collective insecurity. Yeah.
Correct. And I think this is a discussion at least NATO is not willing to have, but we should have it. It's the only collective security bloc that is expanding, if you think about it.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, Roberto. And it fills me with happiness that you in Costa Rica can see this with so much realist clarity, whereas the Europeans uh, and the Americans too are caught in some strange form of mass delusion that they lack the ability to see what their unilateral actions are doing toward the overall security environment, the security architecture of the Eurasian continent. But it's good that you see that so clearly.
I mean, it's hard. I enjoyed very much my master's process, probably because well, I'm not young and I've been around, and so you come to the course with some better understanding of power dynamics and international politics. You're more experienced and older, and it was brutal for me to realize how much of colonialism and eurocentrism still remains in every element of our lives. And I think that we have to accept the fact that the eurocentric system has worked in many ways, but not in security, not in terms of peace and security. Um, on the contrary, I mean, we cannot keep seeing the way the Europeans do, because war is so embedded in the mind of the Europeans that they cannot think a word without war, and if you cannot think a word without war, you cannot build it. That's why I criticize so much the fact that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council know nothing about peace. I mean, how are you going to bring peace if you know nothing about peace? You only know about war and colonialism. And are you really in charge of the word security? No, it's completely broken. I mean, Costa Rica should be a permanent member of the Security Council. We know nothing about war. I mean, we only know the only thing we have to know about war, that is that it should not happen. And if it happens, it has to stop as soon as possible. And that's the only thing you have to know about war. And we know that very well. We should be in the Security Council, as a permanent member. Um, so I mean, it's just these, you know, many, and you know these very well, many of the discussions and debates on international law remain very Eurocentric. And even the fact that material is mostly in English is an issue. The language is still, it's an issue, or in French. And si vous parlez pas de français, on est tout mal. So it's, I mean, to me, it's just been very interesting to face colonialism in the legal, in the law. I mean, you can bring it in the law. You see the traces of this colonialism, of this warlike mentality. And I think it would do very, very good for European countries to hear other points of view, particularly coming from people who has a different experience regarding peace and war. A different experience because Costa Rica never thought of its neutrality as a political tool, like a chessboard piece, exactly like Swiss, that it was recognized because it was in a treaty, because it would serve all these empires if we had a central state in the center of Europe. Um, eh, no, here it was our own decision. And it was not because it's in your interest, no, it's because we think it's in the interest of everybody that we are not part of any other conflict. So yeah, it's this is something that has to change. I mean, we really cannot continue with uh, so much burden as the Eurocentric understanding of international law brings. We need more fresh ideas.
I, I absolutely agree with you, Roberto. And if they ever bring create the vote Costa Rica for a permanent seat of the Security Council, you will have my vote, and I will once you sit there because you absolutely understand how to de-escalate this European-made 500-year colonial project BS that comes with war and death and destruction. Roberto, I always ask my guests at the very end, is there any place where you regularly publish things where people can find your writings?
Not really. It is not until very recently that I decided to devote myself more on the academic side. Pretty much because I find myself in the need to bring these other perspective, or to push it somehow. So I haven't really published much. I'm in the process of doing that. I think you were kind enough to put my thesis on your website, something that I very much appreciate. But for the moment, maybe you find some articles, on Google.
I mean, there's is no need. I just ask so people can know. And everybody, I will put a link to Roberto's master thesis on Costa Rica's neutrality and the precedents for unilateral actions into the link of as a link into the description of this video. Roberto Zamora, thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure. It was a great opportunity to bring out these issues in the Costa Rican experience, which I think has been underestimated. And really, I don't know if this is some nationalistic thing or not, but I really think it would be worth it to give a little bit more study to the Costa Rican experience and understand it not as a selfish act, but as a tool for de-escalation, pacification, and more friendly relations in the international concert. So Pascal, thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberto.